Welcome. I am so incredibly excited you're joining us today because we are diving headfirst into what I can literally only describe as a 1,500-year-old historical true crime investigation. We're doing some serious literary archaeology today, looking at the Maghreb campaigns and comparing two legendary military conquerors. These were men who supposedly lived a full century apart, fighting for totally different empires. But as we start pulling at the threads of these source materials, a massive, mind-blowing pattern starts to emerge. So, let's jump right in.
So, here is the core question we are tackling in this explainer. What if the history you thought you knew was actually a brilliant, elaborate piece of historical plagiarism? I mean, really think about it. Our investigation centers on the mind-boggling structural similarities between two absolute titans of history. On one side, we have the Byzantine general Solomon. He was the right-hand man to the famous Belisarius. And on the other, the legendary Arab conqueror Uqba ibn Nafi. Their lives are separated by over 100 years, but when you look at their campaigns, their enemies, and especially their tragic downfalls, it's almost suspiciously identical.
To really grasp this mystery, you've got to look at the timeline. Check out the massive gaps here. We've got Solomon fighting his battles around 544 AD, and his deeds are documented almost immediately by the Byzantine historian Procopius. Beautiful, straightforward record-keeping. Then we have Uqba's famous campaign, which supposedly went down in 683 AD. But here's the catch, and it is a big one. The Arabic sources detailing Uqba's life, like the texts from Ibn Abd al-Hakim, weren't actually written down until over 200 years later. That is 2 full centuries of total silence before Uqba's legendary deeds were officially put on paper.
Now this is where it gets fascinating. Our primary suspects in this literary heist are the Abbasid-era writers. These guys weren't battlefield eyewitnesses interviewing old, grizzled soldiers. Not at all. They were learned scribes sitting comfortably in the recently conquered cities of Carthage and Alexandria. And what's crucial here is that they likely had absolute, unrestricted access to the old Byzantine libraries left behind. Picture them surrounded by centuries of written administrative documents and chronicles, literally the exact texts describing the old Byzantine campaigns. Keep that context in your back pocket as we examine our first major piece of evidence.
Okay, let's open up Exhibit A. We're going to look at the actual geography of their military campaigns, because as any historian will tell you, armies leave physical traces and geography rarely lies. Let's compare what are known as their lightning marches. On the left side of our board, there's Solomon. His expedition pushed Byzantine power right up to the edge of the Sahara, deep into Mauritania. He's portrayed as the ultimate restorer of order after the chaotic Vandal wars. Now look at the right side. Here's Uqba, famous for his own lightning march from Kairouan all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. Both of these leaders are presented to the reader in the exact same way, unstoppable, lightning-fast conquerors who suddenly bring total, ruthless control to territories that have been in rebellion for decades. But the real smoking gun? It's in the route itself.
Look at this weird geographical anomaly. According to the texts, Uqba's massive desert army mysteriously traveled from one ancient Byzantine garrison town to another. His march perfectly traces the Limes Tripolitanus, the old Roman and Byzantine border defense system. But here's the massive problem with that. Those specific garrison towns were flourishing and fully operational back in General Solomon's day. By the time Uqba supposedly made his march in the late 7th century, archaeology tells us those towns were long abandoned, crumbling, and completely swallowed by the sand.
So, what does this all mean? Well, it means Uqba's army wasn't navigating the reality of an actual 7th century desert. The Abbasid writers were literally just reading an old map. They used the geographical data from Solomon's era to plot out Uqba's journey. It's a geographical impossibility, right? It strongly suggests that these later scribes simply copied the campaign route straight out of those old Byzantine records, gathering dust in the libraries of Carthage. Moving on to Exhibit B. Geography is really just the beginning here. Because, let's face it, every legendary hero needs a worthy, complex villain to drive the narrative forward. In both of these historical epics, the main antagonist fits perfectly into what scholars call the insulted vassal literary trope. For Solomon, his rival is Antilos, a Mari leader who actually fought alongside the Byzantines at first, but went rogue when his people were mistreated. For Uqba, the rival is Kusela, an iconic Berber leader who initially submits, converts to Islam, but then leads a massive, crushing rebellion against Uqba. The structural character arc of the villain is a flawless mirror image. And the trigger for their betrayal? In terms of its literary function, it's practically identical. Uqba dramatically humiliates Kusila by forcing him to slaughter sheep for the army, which sparks the proud leader's righteous rebellion.
Guys, this isn't just some random historical anecdote. This is a classic late antique literary device. It was specifically used by writers to explain how a loyal ally suddenly turns into a bitter enemy. The motives match up so perfectly because the writers are using the exact same narrative template.
All right, Exhibit C. This is the smoking gun. If you're still feeling a little skeptical, you really need to see how the final days of both commanders played out.
Let's systematically lay out the evidence of their final battles. Both men make the exact same fatal tactical error, pure overconfidence. In 544 AD, Solomon arrogantly splits his army and walks right into a deadly ambush. In 683 AD, Uqba does the exact same thing. He sends the bulk of his forces back to Kairouan, leaving himself terribly exposed. And who ambushed them? The exact same Berber groups, the Araba and Sanhaja tribes. The architectural blueprint of their downfall is absolutely identical.
Let's treat these texts like physical evidence in a true crime dossier. Procopius writes that Solomon, with his small unit, is ambushed and killed by Berbers near the town of Silium. Fast forward, and Albin Abd al-Hakam writes that Uqba, left with just 300 riders, is ambushed by Kusayla near the town of Tahuta, where he falls in battle. But if you look at a map, Tahuta and Silium are located on the exact same strategic Byzantine route. The topography of their death is identical.
But here is where the absolute genius of the Abbasid writers shines through: the theological echo. The physical event is the same, sure, but the theological meaning was completely overhauled to fit a new religious narrative. For the Byzantine writer Procopius, Solomon's death is a tragic tale of hubris. It's God punishing him for his pride. But for the later Arab writers, Uqba's identical death is reframed as a divine reward. Uqba doesn't split his army out of foolish pride. He does it because God wants to grant him the ultimate glory of martyrdom. It is the exact same event, just given a brilliant new spiritual coat of paint.
So, we arrive at the verdict. After digging through the maps, analyzing the characters, and inspecting the battlefields, it's time to wrap up this investigation and deliver our academic conclusion.
When you synthesize all these clues, the topographical duplication of abandoned routes, the shared insulted vassal trope, the matching tactical blunders, and identical fatal ambushes on the exact same route against the exact same foes, the conclusion is honestly undeniable. Ibn Abd al-Hakam and his peers absolutely weren't relying on the fragmented oral traditions of old soldiers. They were pulling their material directly from written Byzantine administrative chronicles.
And this brings us to a really powerful realization. The legendary career of Uqba bin Nafi, as recorded in these later texts, is essentially an Arabization of the Byzantine general Solomon. Those Abbasid writers sitting in the libraries needed a grand origin story for their new empire in the Maghreb, so they used the old Byzantine chronicles as a narrative blueprint, masterfully transforming a historical local leader into a universal Islamic hero. It is a breathtaking piece of literary engineering.
But before we close the book on this explainer, I have to leave you with a bit of a cliffhanger. Because if this level of literary appropriation happened here in the Maghreb, it probably wasn't an isolated incident. Let's look a little further ahead in history, across the water to the conquest of Spain. Historians are now starting to look closely at another legendary Islamic conqueror, Musa ibn Nusayr. And the massive question on everyone's mind is this: did the famous Christian chronicles of Isidore of Seville provide the exact same kind of narrative blueprint for Musa's conquest of the Iberian Peninsula? Is history repeating itself, quite literally, on the pages of these manuscripts? It completely challenges how we view our historical heroes. If the grand epics of our past, these incredible stories of conquest and martyrdom, are sometimes just literary echoes constructed by